Hello and welcome to TJ's Garden. Today I'm going to talk about stepping up plants because I already covered in the seed starting episode how to get them started, so stepping up is the next step. Before I did that though, I did want to talk a little bit about the seed starting episode. I've added a note to the show notes on that one. In the episode I did mention Baker Creek Seeds a few times. It's been brought to my attention that they have a sort of history with Clive Bundy, and I was not aware of that, which is weird because they actually on their YouTube channel they have a video where they visit, I believe it's him, they visit in prison while he's in prison, and I never put two and two together and realized that's who they were talking about. Clive Bundy is charitably called an anti-government activist. However, that's not quite what he is, and he does have an agenda based on the sovereign citizen movement. He's kind of been turned into a folk hero over basically just refusing to pay his bills. So there's a lot. There's issues with racism and other things with him, and I just never realized that Baker Creek was tied up with him the way they are. I've had some red flags with Baker Creek for several years. They have several articles on their website that make claims they're just factually incorrect. They have been pushing the crookneck watermelon, which is something that Clive Bundy himself is a major grower of, as a traditional Native American crop, even though there is absolutely no evidence that watermelons existed in the Americas prior to European contact. Watermelons are an African crop. They were brought here as part of the triangle trade with slaves, and it's got a really dark history behind it, but it's not, as far as anybody can provide any evidence, there's no history of them in North America. Indigenous people grew a variety of squash and other crops, some of which did similar things, but they didn't. There's just no evidence. And so, yeah, those were always red flags for me. And then finding out the Clive Bundy thing has just pushed me. I'm not going to buy from them in the future. I'm not recommending anybody else buy from them. If you have to, because of budgetary reasons, or there's a variety, you just have to have that they're the only ones who sell. I'm not going to judge anybody for doing what they got to do. Times are tough. Times are always tough for some folks. I'm nobody's dad. I won't tell you what to do. I'm just saying I'm not recommending them anymore. So with that unfortunate business out of the way, let's get to stepping up. So when you start seeds, you don't actually need nutrition in the soil, as I mentioned in the seed starting episode, because they bring their own in the form of the endosperm. And so generally speaking, you only then need to feed them when they start producing their true leaves and they start actually photosynthesizing and are no longer reliant on the nutrients they started their life with. So once you begin to see a couple of true leaves, that's when you need to get them out of that mix and put them in something with some nutrition, or start either using a liquid fertilizer or some other fertilizer on your seed starting mix. I generally step up unless I have basically a plant that's ready to go and soil that's ready to go outside that I can just plant directly to. When I start seeds during the actual growing season, I don't usually bother with stepping up. But I'm having to do so a little early because, as I mentioned, I'm growing beans. I'm starting them early, which you generally do not have to do, and I generally would not recommend. But I am doing it because I wanted to kind of get a jump start on the season this year. I had a really slow start last year, and I feel like I need to get a jump start to really accomplish more. Part of that may just be me doing the incredibly horrible thing of comparing myself to Instagrammers, I guess, which a lot of us do, and it's unfortunate. But whatever, I wanted to start them early. I knew it was a bad idea, but I did it anyway. And so now they are ready for some supplementary nutrition. They've finished off the little cotyledons, little bean seed leaves that they start out with. They've drained those down. They're starting to fall off, and they are actually starting to experience a little bit of yellowing because they're not getting any nutrients. So it's time. So what I did was I just moved them up to a 4-inch pot, and in that mix I added some nutrition. So let's talk about nutrition. I have several times over the years, not just in preparation for this, but just as a gardener in general. Even when I was going to school for it, I've looked for nursery recommendations for fertilizing your plants, and you will be surprised to find there aren't very many good ones. There hasn't been an extensive amount of research because the number of factors that can affect the fertility of a potting medium is pretty high, and it's going to vary a lot, nursery to nursery, country to country, water supply to water supply, growing medium to growing medium. Because basically, the first step is the growing medium, right? And when you're making up your mix, you are basically trying to create something that, in the case of something other than a seed starting mix, you want some nutrition in that soil. You want something for the plant to actually eat. You will probably have to, in potted plants, you'll have to supplement that. But in plants being grown specifically to be planted out, you're usually not going to worry too much about that because they're not going to be in those pots for that long. But generally speaking, you want to get some nutrition in there, and you want some things that will allow the plants to stand up. You know, they need something to kind of grip on, and they also need mediums for gas exchange. There has to be a variable pore size so that both air and water can get through the medium easily. That also means you always hear that phrase, free draining, but water retention, things like that. And it seems like, less fat, more filling. It seems like a nonsense phrase, like marketing. But what they basically mean is you want a medium where the pore size is such that excess water drains freely, so you don't have standing water in your pot. But at the same time, you want the material that's in that pot, the actual growth medium itself, you want something porous, something that will absorb and hold on to water, so the water is there for your plants. But it's not being held in a stagnant, pool or a puddle on top, or the whole soil isn't just remaining completely sodden and basically muddy. So you need something that free drains, but that does still hold on to it, right? So kind of think more like a sponge, right? If I chopped up a sponge and put it in a pot and I ran water over that, a good chunk of that water is going to run right through the pot. But the sponge itself will absorb water. It's just that any additional water won't have anything blocking it. It'll run right between the spaces between the cut up sponge, and it'll go right out the bottom. And that's what you're looking for in a growth medium. But because loads of different materials can fit the bill, and different countries tend to use different ones, and gardeners tend to use whatever's available to them, that can affect how nutrients are held up. You also can have issues with nutrient availability based on the pH of that material, the pH of the water you're watering with, how hard or soft your water is, mineral deposits in the growing medium itself, and the different materials growing medium can be made out of can also contribute to all these things. So unfortunately, you're never going to find a hard and fast rule, because at the end of the day, fertilizing, and I'm going to do a full fertilizer episode, so I'll cover this in more detail, but fertilizing is feeding the soil, not the plants. In gardening and agriculture more specifically, but gardening to a degree as well, our plants are drawing nutrients out of the soil. And so fertilizing is just making sure they're back in the soil in the areas where the plant roots can actually get to them in forms that the plant can actually use it. Which is why using loads of organic matter and not intensively fertilizing, even though you might not get, super huge growth and everything else, can still work. I mean, I know plenty of gardeners who don't bring anything into their gardens to speak of. They just have a pretty aggressive composting regimen, and maybe they pick up a bag of chicken manure or two every year and, spread that around. But that's it. That's it as far as soil nutrition. And it can be enough because active soil biology, especially in the rhizosphere around your plants, which plants are basically gardeners themselves, they release compounds to create an active rhizosphere. But that area around the root zone, which is what the rhizosphere is teeming with life and should be, and is good for it because all those microbes are breaking down compounds and making them available. And all fertilizer is doing is replacing stuff that may be missing. And so you're feeding that soil. You're trying to feed the soil biology, which is why we use organic matter and other things in the soil that don't directly have high nutrient levels, right? They don't have that high nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or NPK levels. They just provide something that all the bacteria and worms and insects and everything else in the soil need to free up those nutrients from the soil. But the other side of the equation is actually then supplementing deficiencies in the soil. And when you're dealing with soil-based horticulture, agriculture, you can just test the soil to see what's missing, what's there. Nitrogen, as I said in the previous episode, is always a limiting factor. So you're always going to be adding some amount of nitrogen, and you're always going to be managing the nitrogen supply. But your other nutrients are oftentimes quite stable and will stay there for forever until they're taken out. So in many cases, in non-agricultural soils like ours, that's not going to be a limiting factor because there's going to be plenty of that. But when you're dealing with agricultural soils, those can become depleted, and that's why you need to fertilize these other things. Now, another nutrient that is sometimes considered a macronutrient or micronutrient, there's a lot of debate over how much plants actually need. Some plants seem to need a lot. Onions, alliums, anything in that group does. Some don't. That's sulfur. And in Australia and a few other places, they have NPK-S, and the S is sulfur. Okay, so what does all this have to do with your potted plants and stepping up? Well, when you're making your growth medium, you need to add fertilizer. The problem is, because it's not economical to test growing medium, and in many cases, the tests you have won't test non-soil based conditions. So a soil test isn't going to work on a soilless medium. You have to test it differently to see what's there. But it's not practical to do so. Your nutrients are likely to be depleted rather rapidly, so whatever test you do is not likely to be that practical long term. And the ability of your medium to hold nutrients is going to vary on so many factors. So there's really no hard and fast rule. There are guidelines. And if you check with your local agricultural extension or anything like that, they can provide some guidelines. Pretty much all fertilizer products are going to have some guidelines for potted plants on the back, and those are an okay place to start, but you're basically going to have to dial it in. You're going to have to experiment with different amounts in your mix with different plants in different conditions to figure out what you need. And because a lot of gardeners only really bother with this at the beginning of the season, this could take a while because you're only going to be doing it once a year. If you're starting plants year round, which I do, then you're going to get a little more experience with it. In my experience, I've found that if I use a fairly high amount of organic matter, usually almost straight compost if I can find something sufficiently porous, compost mixed with leaf mold if I have it. Sometimes I'll use perlite or vermiculite, but I honestly have been moving more and more away from that. I also don't use peat or core because both of those, there's this whole debate, peat or core, but they both kind of have issues. It really depends on who you believe as far as which one's more environmentally friendly. Core is a waste product made from coconut fibers, but you actually do have to manufacture core. Like, core doesn't come in the form gardeners use it from the byproduct. The byproduct is just clumps of coconut husks, and then that has to actually go to a facility where it's broken down to core, and that process is not environmentally great. It's not terrible. It's just, it does require petroleum to power everything. It does require, human labor. It requires heating and various other resources to be used to help break that stuff down. So it's a process, and it's a whole industry. And on the flip side, peat has issues with environmental sustainability, not so much the amount we take, because even though quite a bit of peat is harvested, and I actually don't buy the claim that a lot of people are making these days that it's sustainable because what we take is nowhere near what's being produced every year, because the environments that we're taking it from are never truly restored, right? Peat bogs build up over hundreds and hundreds of years, and that whole ecosystem has had a huge amount of time to develop, and you can't just dump some more fresh peat on top to start growing again and call it good. And the claim that it grows more than we harvest is based on some relatively simple math from the Canadian peat industry that I'm not totally on board with as well. But either way, I don't find either of them that necessary. I use them when I have to for certain plants, but for the most part, I avoid it. I just use a straight compost-based mix usually with minimal perlite, vermiculite. I've tried actually using more horticultural grit, which is very common in Europe and especially England. In America, we've usually moved to perlite or vermiculite, but honestly, I haven't found, at least with small pots, with larger pots, it's different, but with small pots, I haven't found much dramatic difference in weight or density of the material to really rule it out as a material I use. So I've used it a bit, but for the most part, I use a nice coarse compost, and that's it. And so what I do is I usually mix in something in the range of a 555 fertilizer. And this is an important thing to remember. When you're looking at your fertilizer, if you're looking at an organic fertilizer, whatever isn't NPK, it's going to be filler material, but that filler material is likely going to contain trace minerals and other compounds that are useful. Additionally, there is some discussion over whether some of the compounds brought along with, say, kelp and other materials have beneficial effects on plant growth. So usually a lot of those fertilizers are going to be based on byproducts of various things, the food industry, fishing industry, stuff like I mentioned before. Milorganite is made by breaking down sewage waste and things like that with bacteria and then harvesting that bacteria. So there are a lot of different ways that organic fertilizers are made, and a lot of that filler material is not just filler. It has good things in it. When you're talking about synthetic fertilizers, they tend to have very high NPKs, and the extra material is often literally filler. It is some inert material that they just use to bulk it up, or in the case of liquid fertilizers, it's often just water. If the fertilizer doesn't say that it has trace minerals or trace materials or trace vitamins or whatever, the micronutrients essentially, if it doesn't say it, it may not actually have it at all. And so that's a different thing you want to look for. You want to look for, especially when you're doing potted plants, because there is nothing in that medium usually. You're going to want to look for the trace minerals and other things in there. So that's how you would pick the fertilizer. But the important thing to remember with NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, is it's a ratio. So if you buy 555 or you buy 10-10-10 or you buy 20-20-20, the ratio is the same, which means that if I use 3 times as much 10-10-10, I'm getting 30-30-30, right? I'm getting the equivalent of that. Obviously, I have all the extra bulk material to deal with, but I'm getting the same amount in that volume. So it's partially an economical issue. I tend to go low. I tend to do a 555 because I found that my growing media doesn't tend to hold the extra phosphorus and potassium that high. Also, for reasons I'll get into in a minute, 555 doesn't mean 5% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, 5% potassium. The nitrogen is 5%, but the other two are different. I'll get to that in a minute. But my mediums that I use generally don't hold them disproportionately, and I'm not leaving them in there for a very long amount of time. So a simple 555 lets me get enough nutrients to my plants for them to get a good start before I get them out in the ground, but it isn't enough to cause any kind of fertilizer burn or any other problems with the plants. So I generally find if I go milder, it's better for me. But I'm also using compost, which can vary pretty wildly in its NPK depending upon where I get it. Usually it's very low. Compost is not a fertilizer in general, but in some cases, as I mentioned in my nitrogen episode, it can be quite high. As high in some cases as a organic fertilizer. So it's something I kind of keep in mind. I go a little bit low, and for me that works. You may not. And if you're using chemical fertilizers, it may be a completely different issue because those tend to penetrate better, tend to get to the plant better in a form it can use immediately. But also, a lot of it's going to run off when you water those plants. A lot of that's going to go right out the bottom of your pot. And so you may find your applications are different. You may find your watering schedule needs to change to accommodate those applications. You may apply and then water a day later than you do just to make sure some more of it gets absorbed. So again, this is a process of dialing in, but a simple guideline I can give you is if you're using a primarily compost based growing medium, then a low 555 or similar balanced fertilizer is going to be best. Okay, so why is 555 not 5%, 5%, 5%? Well, the nitrogen is, but the form of potassium and phosphate. In the case of phosphorus, it's phosphorus pentoxide. In the case of potassium, it's potassium oxide. Those are actually how we traditionally measured the P and K in fertilizer. And because of that, all of the P and the K is not actually phosphorus and potassium. In the case of phosphorus, it's about 43.6% of what they're actually measuring. So you end up, basically, if you take whatever the phosphorus value is and you multiply it by 0.436, you get about the percentage of phosphorus in that material. And for the potassium, it comes out about 83% potassium. Most of it's actually, or a good chunk of it's actually oxygen, not most of it. Most of it is potassium. And so that one you'd multiply by 0.83 to get your percentage. So in the case of 555, they're both going to be quite a bit lower than the nitrogen. But nitrogen tends to be the limiting factor anyway, and the other two tend not to be as necessary. Now, it's actually a good thing the phosphorus is as low as it is, because at least when you're actually fertilizing the soil, and we'll get into this when I do a more general fertilization episode, in the soil, we actually tend to have a lot of phosphorus because it tends to stick around. And in most suburban areas and most agricultural areas, we put enough phosphorus in the ground already. We actually, in some areas, have issues with phosphorus toxicity. We have too much phosphorus in some areas, especially in and around where people grow their lawns, because people would throw these very high NPK value, balanced fertilizers at their lawn year after year without testing the soil or doing anything else. And they were just accumulating more and more and more phosphorus that their plants didn't need. So it's an actual problem. And runoff is a problem. And there are a lot of problems. Gardening is not a problem. Gardening is fun. So you've got your soil mix. You've got your NPK. So stepping up is literally just move the plant into the new mix. And what that's going to do is it's going to buy you a week to 2 weeks of growth, because it usually takes about 2 weeks for the plant to completely take all the nutrients. But depending upon the growth rate of the plant, it can be as little as a week. So that's why in a lot of cases they fertilize weekly. If the plants are going to be in those pots, that's not a bad idea, is to top up the fertilizer, every week or so, just with a small application of additional fertilizer. Again, I usually use something relatively low, but depending upon your needs, it may be different. And so, every 7 days, in some cases you can go as long as 14 days, you do need to refertilize those. But ideally, you should be planning this out so that they aren't spending more than a few weeks in those pots anyway. They shouldn't be in there very long. Because the goal, in the case of starts at least, is to get those out in the ground, or at least in larger pots. And so I'm going to do an episode on in-ground fertilization, and I'm going to do an episode on container growing as just a thing, especially grow bags, which I've been using a lot more of lately. But I do want to say in this episode that grow bags are not a good way to create starts in my experience. I'm going to put a bunch of caveats on this though. Grow bags that are intended to break down the soil, first thing in my experience, they don't. I have pictures of, those little mesh bags around different growing pods and stuff that you're supposed to be able to plant in the ground. They're supposed to break down within, that first year. And I pulled plants 1-2 years later out of the ground, and that little mesh bag is still around the core of the root ball. So a lot of those don't break down, but those are usually okay because the roots will grow through them. But when you're talking about grow bags, like the kind used to actually be used instead of pots, which I've started using fairly extensively because I have space limitations and I don't want to pay for pots every time. And grow bags are easier to move around, easier to manipulate. They're relatively cheap. Grow bags tend to have an issue because they root prune, meaning when your roots try to grow through the grow bag medium, once they grow into that kind of grow bag itself, the fabric, generally the airflow through that fabric is enough to kill off the root tips. So the roots kind of prune themselves, and then that stimulates root growth further back in the root. So the roots are growing out continuously and being stopped rather than growing in circles inside the container. And this is good for plant health in, perennials and other plants that are growing in those containers for a while, or even annual ornamentals, or, tomatoes or peppers or whatever you're growing in your grow bag. If you're growing something in that grow bag to stay in that grow bag, that's fine. What I've had a problem with is transplanting from grow bags, because when those roots air prune like that, they remain embedded in the media around it. And so when you try to pull the plant out, the roots are sticking to that bag pretty aggressively. Now, I've only had to do it once because I was transferring a plant from one grow bag to another, and I didn't want to shred the grow bag. If you don't care about the grow bag, because some of them are $1 or so a piece, and you're not concerned about having to throw away the grow bag, then it's not as big a problem. You could cut it off. But yeah, I wouldn't buy small grow bags with the intention of getting plants up to a certain size and then getting those in the ground. They are not good as a transfer solution, but they are really good just to grow additional plants in instead of paying for pots that can break, because grow bags don't break. That's what I like about them. They can, wear out after a while. Obviously, they have a limited shelf life, but they don't crack. Plastic pots don't do great in our weather here because our air is slightly acidic and we get really high heat in the summer. So plastic pots can break down. Grow bags do not. So I love grow bags. I will recommend grow bags for all kinds of growing. Have a patio covered in plants growing in grow bags. I say nothing bad about them in that regard, but they are not good to grow starts in, because your primary goal isn't going to be to get them out. One thing I've seen that I like, I haven't seen them as much here in the US, but I've seen them in gardening shows abroad, because I watch Gardener's World and I watch Gardening Australia pretty often, is root trainers. And they're usually plastic, unfortunately, but I'm trying to reduce my own plastic usage as well. I say that. I bought a bunch of plastic pots recently to get a jump start on this year, so I'm not living up to it, but I would like to cut back on my plastic usage. And I've seen these root trainers that are basically, they fold up, and you have to put them in something to hold them up because they don't stand upright on their own. But they fold up like a little clamshell, and you get like 4 or 5 different little pots across the top that are long and kind of narrow, so the roots kind of grow down into them. And they're really good, especially for growing perennials, but you can also use them to grow other things. But the great thing is that when you open that clamshell, then you have these nice little pods that come right out and you plant right in the ground, which are a little easier to handle than some tube stock. Not extensively, it's just convenient essentially, because you just pop it open and there you are. You don't have to worry about when you're pulling it out, the root ball coming apart or the soil breaking up. It's all just one nice little compact thing inside of essentially a mold. So you're not depotting, you're just opening it and essentially demolding, which is nice. I wish those would become more common. I wish they were more durable so they lasted longer, so you're not quite having to go through so much plastic. They mostly seem to come as these little thin, flimsy plastic things in a kit that is largely disposable, so I'm not overly fond of that, but I like the idea. Barring that, tube stock is great for starting perennials, but we're talking more about vegetables today, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But anyway, that's how you step up your plants. That's why you step up your plants. And hopefully enough about fertilizer to confuse you, because it is a confusing field sometimes, but also to make it clear that you really just need to try it and experiment. It's not something you can get perfect from the start, so don't worry about it. Don't be intimidated. Just get some. I would start with a organic fertilizer that's fairly low. You can then experiment with other fertilizers later, but something with a fairly low NPK, something in the 5.55 range. Just get that in a mix, step up your plants, see how they respond, see how they, over the course of a week or two, how they do, if they look healthy, if they look like they're yellowing or losing leaves or shriveling or whatever, kind of just keep an eye on it and adjust as necessary. And eventually you'll get kind of dialed into what you need for your situation. And you may find that you don't even want to use fertilizer. You may just use material to go into that growth medium that already has some nutrition. Something with, say, like maybe you want to work in, manures or worm castings in some cases can have decent NPK. But it's going to vary quite a bit depending on what you feed the worms. Same thing with soldier fly larva composting. That's going to vary a bit too. But you can work those things into potting mix and maybe find a solution that works for you that doesn't require much additional fertilizer at all, which in some cases would be ideal. Anyway, that's all I have to say about stepping up for today. I just wanted to kind of do a little episode as a sort of dovetail to seed starting, since I'm dealing with that. Largely due to my own hubris at growing beans, when beans grow best just put right in the ground and allowed to grow. They don't need to be started like this. Something I'm doing, and so it's caused me to have this issue, which I want to share with all of you. I hope that's helpful. If you want to, you can reach out to tjsgarden.com. I have my Mastodon, Twitter, and email links there, so you can reach out to me and ask questions. If I've gotten something glaringly wrong and you can provide correction and, actual links to sources to substantiate those corrections, I am happy to receive them, because I can be wrong, as can anybody else. Anyway, get out in your garden and take back the full value of your labor. This has been TJ's Garden, and I'm its creator, Troy Truchon, and as such, I'm releasing this under a Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International Creative Commons license, meaning that you can share this, alter it, do whatever you want with it, provided you give me credit and you don't deny anybody the right to do the same with any derivative works. You can find the information on that license at the Creative Commons website at creativecommons.org.